Hi, I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. 2 days ago, my son called me at 11 o'clock at night and said something about his wife that I have never heard him say about anybody. He said, "I can't do this anymore." I want to stop you right there, because I know exactly what that sentence does when you hear it cold, and I am not going to let it sit for even 4 seconds. Nothing is wrong with that marriage. Nothing. There is no trouble. There is no crisis. Nobody is leaving anybody, and if you have clicked on this hoping for that you are going to be disappointed in about 90 seconds, and I would rather disappoint you now. They are fine. They are better than fine. But my son was furious. Genuinely, properly furious, in a way I have seen perhaps 6 times in 36 years, and every one of the other 5 was about football. He was furious at Taylor Swift. And here is the thing that I want you to hold on to for the next 40 minutes, because it is the whole story. He was right. He was completely right. Every single word he said to me on that phone call was correct and fair, and I could not argue with one syllable of it. And he was also about to do something extremely stupid, and he was going to do it that night, and I did not stop him. I did not stop him because I did not know how. I sat in my kitchen in Cleveland with the phone against my ear at 11 o'clock at night, while my son said true things in a voice I did not recognize, and I said the useless thing that mothers say, which is, sleep on it. And he said, no. And I hung up, and I sat there, and I thought, he is going to say this to her tonight, and it is true, and true is not the same as right, and I do not know what to do. So I called Kylie. 11:20 at night, a woman with 4 children under 7. She picked up on the second ring and said, "Is everybody okay?" And I said, "No." I told her the whole thing. It took about 6 minutes. And when I finished, Kylie Kelce did not say anything for a moment. And then she said, "Give me his number." I said, "You have his number." And she said, "I know. I'm working up to it." She called him at 11:40. I know it was 11:40, because both of them independently told me the time, which is how I know everything in this story is right. And she said 6 words to him inside the first 30 seconds of that phone call. And my son, 36 years old, 6 feet 5 inches tall, furious, correct, and about to do something he could not have taken back, did not speak for 1 full minute. 6 words. I am going to tell you what they were, and I am going to tell you what he said back, and I am going to tell you what Kylie said after that, which took 9 minutes, and which is the hardest thing anybody has said to this family in the 11 years she has been in it. And I am going to tell you what my son did at 1 in the morning that night. But first I have to tell you why he was angry, because if I do not, you will think he is a monster, and he is not, and the anger is the second most loving thing I have ever seen him do. Part 1. The thing he found out. August 20th, Thursday, the last day of training camp. The Chiefs finished their final padded practice at Missouri Western State University in the morning. Military Appreciation Day. Camp over. 14 of them for my son, possibly the last. He drove back to Kansas City that afternoon, and somewhere on that drive, or that evening, he found something out. I am going to tell you what it was, and it is going to sound small. He found out that Taylor had asked Jason to go to camp. I have told this story elsewhere. On the 19th, Jason turned up at Chiefs camp unannounced. The team posted a photograph. He watched practice, ate an ice cream bar, went and found Andy Reid. Travis had the best practice of the summer, and it looked like a coincidence. It was not. Taylor had called Jason about a week and a half earlier and said, "I can't get there, will you go? And don't tell him I asked." And Jason did not tell him. Travis worked it out on his own. He is not slow. He said to me on the Sunday before, "My brother showed up on a Wednesday in the middle of nowhere in Missouri and pretended it was a coincidence, and my brother has never done anything by coincidence." At the time, he decided not to say anything. He told me, "She went to a lot of trouble to make it not a thing. I'm not going to make it a thing." He said, "I'm just going to know." That was the 16th. And then on the 20th, camp ended. And I think, this is my reconstruction, he has not laid it out this cleanly. I think that when camp ended and the adrenaline of 5 weeks came off him, all the things he had been deciding not to say anything about arrived at once. Because it was not just Jason. Part 2. The list. Here is what my son had been quietly not saying anything about, as of 11 o'clock on the night of August 20th, 2026. 1. She had been getting up at 4:30 in the morning for 17 consecutive nights to take his good-night phone call at his bedtime instead of hers, and she never mentioned it, and he found out by accident on the 7th. 2. She had not said one public word since their wedding on July 3rd, 50 days at that point, and he had worked out that it was about his season, and she had never told him that, and she never intends to. 3. She had sent his brother to camp instead of coming herself, because her coming would have made the story about her and Jason's coming, made the story about an ice cream bar. 4. In May, at my kitchen table, she had asked him what he was afraid of, and he had told her, and it had taken 11 minutes, and she had never once asked him for anything comparable back. 5. In 3 years, she has never told him what she wants. That is the one. That is the one that broke him, and I want to spend some time on it, because it is not what it sounds like. Part 3. She does not ask. Taylor Swift does not ask for things. I do not mean in the large sense. Professionally, she is one of the most decisive human beings I have ever encountered, and if you have ever watched that woman make a business decision, you would not describe her as accommodating. I mean in the small domestic sense. In the what time should we do the call sense. In the where do you want to eat sense. She defers. Instantly, completely, every single time. I asked her about it once, months ago, and she gave me an answer I have never forgotten. She said, "When everything about your life inconveniences everybody around you, you get very reluctant to ask for anything else." She said, "I already cost people so much. The security, the schedules, the fact that nobody can just meet me somewhere. All of that is on the table before I open my mouth." She said, "So when it's something small, I just say yes. It feels like the least I can do." That is a sympathetic answer. It is also, if you are married to her, completely maddening. And on the night of August 20th, my son said it out loud to his mother for the first time. Part 4. What he said. I am going to give you as much of that phone call as I can. He said, "I can't do this anymore." I said, "Do what?" And he said, "I can't be the only one who gets given things." He said, "Mom, I have been married for 7 weeks, and in that time, my wife has given up her entire year, gotten up at 4:30 in the morning for 2.5 weeks straight, arranged for my brother to fly to Missouri so I wouldn't be alone, and never once told me about any of it." He said, "And every single time I find one of them out, it's by accident." He said, "I have found out 4 separate things by accident." He said, "And I keep saying thank you. What am I supposed to do, keep saying thank you? I've said thank you for 3 years." He said, "And every time I say it, she says, 'Of course,' like it's nothing, like it costs nothing, and I know it costs something because I'm not stupid." Then he said the thing. He said, "I asked her in London where she wants to live. I want to slow down here. They are looking at houses. This has been reported, and it is true. They have several places between them, and they have never lived anywhere." He said, I asked her straight out. I said, "Where do you actually want to live?" He said, and she said, "Wherever works." He said, "Wherever works, Mom." He said, I asked my wife where she wants to spend the rest of her life, and she said, wherever works. He said, so I said, no, seriously, if it was completely up to you, where? And she said, it's not completely up to me. You've got a season. He said, and I said, forget the season. Pretend there's no season. Where? And she said, Travis, there is a season. And he said to me, on the telephone, at 11 o'clock at night on August 20th. He said, she wouldn't do it. Mom, she would not do it. I asked her 3 different ways to tell me one thing she wants, and she would not do it. He said, I have been married for 7 weeks, and I do not know where my wife wants to live. Part 4.5, London. I want to give you the whole London conversation, because he described it to me twice, and the second time it came out differently, and the second version is the true one. This was August 14th, the 14 hours. I have told that story elsewhere, the gap in the camp schedule, the flight, the 15 minutes on a pavement at 10 to 6 in the morning. It happened in the middle of the afternoon, London time, hour 10 of 14. They were talking about nothing, which is what he had flown 4,000 miles for, and it came round to houses. He said, it started because she said something about a kitchen. I said, a kitchen? And he said, yeah. She said something about wanting a kitchen with a table in it, not an island, a table. I want to point at that, because I know exactly where that came from and he does not. She said that to me in May, at my own table. She said, I want somewhere where somebody can sit at 11:30 at night with the overhead light off and just the light over the stove on. She said, I want somewhere where somebody can ask a real question. She has never told him, that is my kitchen. I do not think she ever will. So he said, okay, a kitchen with a table, where? And she said, wherever works. He said he did not react at first. He said he let it go, and they talked about something else for about 10 minutes. And then he came back to it. He said, no, hang on. Where do you want to live? And she said, I genuinely don't mind. I've lived everywhere. I'm easy about it. And he said, nobody's easy about it. And she said, I am. He said, so I said, okay, if I said we're moving to Cleveland tomorrow, what would you say? And she said, I'd say okay. And he said, no, you wouldn't. And she said, I would. And he said, Taylor, would you actually want to live in Cleveland? And she said, I'd want to live where you are. He said, and that's when I got, I don't know, something. He said, because that's a beautiful thing to say. That's the nicest thing anybody's ever said to me. He said, and it's not an answer. He said he tried one more time, and this is the version he gave me the second time, which he had not given me the first time, and which I think is the actual moment. He said, I said, forget me, forget the season. If I dropped dead tomorrow, where would you live? I said, Travis. And he said, I know, I know. It was a stupid way to ask. And I said, what did she say? He said, she looked at me for a second. And she said, that's a horrible question. And he said, I know, answer it. And Taylor said, Nashville. He said, and it came out fast. Immediately, no thinking. He said, she had the answer the entire time. She has always had the answer. She just wasn't going to say it while I was in the room. I said, and how did you feel? And my son said, at the time, fine. Relieved. I thought, great. Nashville, that's an answer. We can work with that. He said, and then about 6 days later I was driving back from camp and I thought about it again. He said, and I realized she only gave me the answer when I took myself out of the sentence. He said, I had to tell my wife to imagine I was dead before she'd tell me where she wants to live. That is what he was carrying at 11 o'clock at night on August 20th. And that is why I could not argue with him. Part 5. Why he was right. I want to say something clearly before I go any further. He was right. I want that on the record because I know how this next part goes, and I do not want anybody to think that the correction he received means his complaint was wrong. It was not wrong. A marriage in which one person gives continuously and asks for nothing is not a healthy marriage. It looks like one from the outside. It is extremely easy to mistake for one. But there is a thing that happens to the person on the receiving end. You start to feel managed. You start to feel like a project, like somebody is running an operation on your behalf, expertly, and you are the beneficiary and not the participant. And nobody wants to be a beneficiary in their own marriage. Travis said one more thing on that call, and it is the one I have thought about most. He said, I want her to need something from me. He said, I don't mean a big thing, I mean anything. One thing. I want there to be one thing in this marriage that only I can do. He said, because right now, Mom, she does not need me for anything. He said, she's got people for everything. She's got a person for the schedule, and a person for the security, and a person who's worked for her since 2008. He said, what am I for? Part 6. What I said. Nothing useful. I want to be honest about this, because I have been honest all year about the times I got it wrong, and this is one of the worst ones. I said, she loves you. He said, I know she loves me. That's not the question. I said, give her time. He said, it's been 3 years. I said, she's been through a lot, Travis. She's protecting herself. And my son said, and this is the sentence that made me call Kylie, my son said, he said, from what? From me? And then he said, I'm going to say something to her tonight. And I said, don't do it tonight. And he said, why not? And I said, because you're angry. And he said, I've been not angry about it for 3 years. Where has that got me? And I said, Travis, sleep on it. And he said, no. And he hung up. Part 7. Why I was afraid. I want to explain what I was actually afraid of, because it was not a fight. They have had disagreements. Every couple has. They had one in November of 2024 about something I have written about elsewhere. I was not afraid of a fight. I was afraid he was going to say the true thing in the true way at 11 o'clock at night to a woman who has spent 20 years being told what she is doing wrong by people who are technically correct. Here is the thing about Taylor Swift that I understood about 18 months into knowing her. She can take criticism. She takes it constantly. She has been taking it since she was 17. What she cannot take, what nobody can take, but what she in particular cannot take, is being told that her way of loving somebody is wrong. Because she has spent her whole life being extremely careful with people, and she has done it deliberately, and she believes it is the right way to be. And Travis was about to tell her, at 11 o'clock at night, that the 3 years of carefulness had been landing on him as distance. He would have been right, and it would have gone into her like a nail. So I called Kylie. Part 8, 11:20. She picked up on the second ring. She said, is everybody okay? And I said, no. And she said, immediately, before I said anything else, is it Taylor? I said, how did you know? And Kelce said, because you'd have said Ed or Travis, and you said no. I told her all of it. The 4:30 phone calls, the 50 days, Jason and the ice cream bar, wherever works, what he said about not knowing where his wife wants to live, what he said about what he was for. And I told her he was going to say it tonight. And when I stopped, there was a silence on that phone that went on long enough that I said her name. She said, he's right. I said, I know. And she said, no, Donna, I need you to hear me. He is completely right, and I have been waiting 3 years for somebody in this family to notice. And then she said, give me his number. And I said, you have his number. And Kylie said, I know, I'm working up to it. Part 9. 6 words. She called him at 11:40. I got the account from both of them. Travis told me the next morning. Kylie told me on Friday afternoon. The two accounts agree on every material point, which is how I know it is right. He picked up and said something like, "Hey, everything okay?" Because Kylie does not call him. In 11 years, she has called him perhaps a dozen times. And she said, "Don't call her tonight." And he said, "Kylie." And she said, "Travis. Don't call her tonight." He said, "Did my mother call you?" And Kylie said, "Yes." And he said, "This is ridiculous." And Kylie said, "Probably. Don't call her tonight." And he said, and I want to give you his exact reported words because they matter for what happens next. He said, "You don't know what this is about." And Kelce said, she said, "I know exactly. We're the problem." 6 words. We're the problem. He said he did not speak for about a minute. I asked him about that. I said, "A full minute?" And he said, "Mom, it felt like 10. He said, "Because I knew immediately." I said, "Knew what?" And my son said, that she was right, and I was about to find out how. Part 10. The 9 minutes. Kylie talked for about 9 minutes. I am going to give you as much of it as I have, and I have a great deal, because I asked her to go through it twice on Friday and she did, patiently, while a 4-year-old shouted about something in another room. She said, "I've been in this family 11 years." She said, "And I want to tell you what it's like to marry into it, because you've never had to do it, and you're never going to." She said, "Your family is the warmest family I have ever encountered. That is not a compliment I am building towards something with. It is just true. Your parents are extraordinary. You and Jason would both walk into traffic for anybody at that table." She said, "And it is the hardest family in America to receive anything from." She said, "Travis, when did you last let somebody do something for you?" And he said, "What?" And she said, "Name one. One time in the last 5 years where somebody did something for you, and you just let them." He tried. He told me he tried and could not do it. He said, "I got as far as saying, 'Well, Mom,' and then I realized that everything Mom does for me, I immediately do something back for, and I've been doing that since I was about 9 years old." Kylie said, "That's the family." She said, "Your father took care of things. That is what he did. That is what his father did. That is what the whole thing is built on." She said, "And both of you learned it perfectly. You are both incredibly generous men who have absolutely no idea how to be on the other end of it." She said, and then Taylor married into it. Part 11. The part that got him. She said, "Think about what she walked into." She said, "She came into a family where everybody gives constantly, and nobody asks for anything, and where the way you demonstrate love is by doing things for people without being asked." She said, "And she is a fast learner. She is possibly the fastest learner I have ever met." She said, "So she learned it. In about 8 months." She said, "Travis, she is doing exactly what we taught her to do." She said, "She watched your mother drive to Kansas City in the middle of the night because you called at 11 and said, 'Can you come?' She watched your father hold 2 of your mother's secrets for 47 years without ever bringing them up. She watched me sit at a dinner table for 2 hours and 20 minutes throwing up in my head rather than ruin a meal somebody had cooked." She said, "She has watched this family for 3 years, and every single one of us has shown her the same thing, which is that you love people by absorbing things quietly and not making them your problem." She said, "And she has done it better than any of us because she has more resources and more discipline, and she has been practicing being self-sufficient since she was 17 years old." And then she said the thing. She said, "You are angry that your wife won't ask you for anything." She said, "We are the ones who taught her that asking is a burden." Part 11 and a half. How Kylie knew. I asked her on Friday how she knew all that. Not how she worked out that Travis was wrong. Anybody paying attention could have worked that out. How she had the whole thing ready, 9 minutes, structured, in order, at 11:40 at night, with no preparation. And Kelce said, "Because I did it." I said, "Did what?" And she said, "The whole thing." In 2016, she said, "I did exactly what Taylor's doing, for about 3 years." She said, "I married into this family in 2018, and we'd been together for years before that, and I spent the first stretch of it doing precisely what she's doing, which is absorbing everything, and asking for nothing, and being extremely good about it." She said, "I got very good at being fine." I said, "I remember." And she said, "No, you don't. That's the point. Nobody remembers, because it doesn't look like anything. It looks like a nice woman who never complains." I said, "What changed it?" And she said, "I broke." She said, 2016. February, I think. He'd been gone for the season, and then he came back, and he asked me how the fall had been. She said, and I said fine. Because I always said fine. And she said, and he said, and I don't know what made him do it. He's never done it before or since in that way. He said, "No, actually." "How was it?" She said, and I started crying so hard I had to sit down on the floor. She said, "I hadn't cried in 5 months. Not once. I'd been fine for 5 months." I said, "I never knew about that." And Kylie said, "No. And you wouldn't. That's the whole design." Then she said the thing that made me understand why she was the only person who could have made that phone call on Thursday. She said, "After that, I made a decision." She said, "I decided I was going to ask that man for something once a week, whether I needed it or not." I said, "Once a week?" And she said, "Once a week. For about a year. I made myself do it. I put it in my head like a chore." She said, "Can you get the thing? Can you take her? Can you call so-and-so? I need you to handle this." She said, "Half of them I could have done myself in less time than it took to ask." I said, "Why?" And Kelce said, "Because it's a muscle." She said, "Nobody tells you that. Everybody talks about needing somebody like it's a feeling." She said, "It isn't. It's a muscle, and if you don't use it for 3 years, it stops working, and then you cannot do it even when you want to." She said, "Taylor's muscle has never been used." She said, "Not once, in her whole adult life. Since she was 17 years old, that woman has had people for everything, and has never once had to say, 'Can you help me?' to a human being who was not employed." She said, "So it's not that she won't, it's that she can't. It's gone." She said, "And you don't fix that with a conversation at 11:40 at night about the state of your marriage." She said, "You fix it by giving her something to lift." Part 12. What he said back. He said, "That's not fair." And Kylie said, "It's completely fair." And he said, "Nobody told her not to ask for things." And Kelce said, "Travis, when has anybody in your family ever asked for anything?" He told me he could not answer that either. He said, "I sat there and I went through everybody." He said, "Dad, no. You, no. Mom, you have never once in my entire life asked me for a single thing, and I want to talk to you about that at some point." He said, "Jason, no. Kylie, absolutely not." He said, "And me. I've never asked for anything in my life." Then Kylie said, "And here's the part you're not going to like." And he said, "There's a worse part?" And she said, "Yes." Part 13. The worst part. She said, "We never asked her for anything either." She said, 3 years. Think about it. Has anybody in this family ever asked Taylor Swift for a single thing? She said, "Not a favor. Not a ticket. Not a mention. Not a phone call to somebody. Nothing." She said, "We've all been extremely careful never to ask her for anything because we didn't want to be those people." And she said, which is correct, and it is also the exact same message. She said, we told her, over and over for 3 years, in the nicest possible way, we do not need anything from you. She said, and then we're surprised she doesn't need anything from us. He said, so what do I do? And Kelce said, ask her for something. He said, what? And she said, ask her for something, anything, something small that she can actually do. She said, not a grand gesture, not a conversation about the marriage. Do not have a conversation about the marriage at 11:40 at night, Travis, I am begging you. She said, ask her for one thing you actually want that only she can do. He said, like what? And she said, I have absolutely no idea. She's your wife. And then she said, figure it out and call her tomorrow. And she hung up. Part 14. 1 in the morning. He did not call her tomorrow. He called her that night, at 1 in the morning Central Time, which was 7 in the morning where she was. I want to be clear that both Kylie and I had told him not to, and that he did it anyway, and that in this specific instance he was correct and both of us were wrong. He told me about it on Friday morning. He called me at 7 and said, I did it. And I said, did what? And he said, I asked her for something. I said, what did you ask her for? And my son said, I asked her to teach me a song. Part 15. The Ask. I want to explain why this is the correct answer, because it took me about 4 seconds to understand, and then I had to sit down. Travis sang at his own wedding. I have told that story elsewhere. The choir room in 1998. Somebody laughing. 21 years of not singing like he meant it. And a night in Madison Square Garden, where he opened his mouth in front of Paul McCartney and Stevie Nicks, and did not stop. Since then, he has been singing constantly. In cars. In the shower. He told me in July that something had come unlocked. And there is one thing on this earth that Taylor Swift can do that literally nobody else in his life can do. He said, I called her at 1 in the morning and she picked up, and I said, I need to ask you for something. He said, and there was a pause, and she said, okay. He said, and I could hear her sitting up. He said, I want you to teach me something properly. Not the wedding thing, an actual thing. I want to learn to do it right, and I want you to teach me. And he said there was a silence. And then Taylor said, which song? And he said, you pick. He said, and then she said something I did not expect at all. I said, what? And Travis said, she said, how long have you wanted to ask me that? He said, and I said, about a year. And she said, why didn't you? And I said, because you're you, and it felt like asking for something. He said there was a longer silence. And then his wife said, Travis, I have been waiting 3 years for somebody in this family to ask me for something. Part 15 and a half. The first lesson. They did the first one on Friday. I found out because Travis called me on Friday night, and he was, I am going to use the word, and I do not use it lightly, about a 36-year-old man. He was giddy. He said, Mom, she's a nightmare. I said, what? And he said, she's the worst. She's an absolute tyrant. I've been shouted at for 50 minutes. I said, what happened? And he said, so we did it on video. She's over there, I'm here. We did it on a screen for about an hour. He said, and I thought it was going to be nice. He said, it was not nice. He said, I sang about 4 bars, and she stopped me and said, no. He said, not that's good. Let's try it another way. She said, no. And he said, and I said, no what? And she said, you're doing the thing. Do it again without the thing. And he said, what thing? And she said, the thing where you make it slightly funny, so if it's bad, it doesn't count. He went quiet on the phone when he told me that. And then he said, Mom, I've been doing that my whole life and nobody has ever said it to me. He said, so I did it again. And she stopped him again. And he said, I got stopped 11 times in the first 20 minutes. He said, I have not been coached like that since I was about 19 years old. I said, was it awful? And my son said, it was the best hour I've had all year. He said, because she wasn't being nice to me. He said, for 3 years that woman has been unbelievably kind to me and completely accommodating about everything, and it has been wonderful. He said, and on Friday she told me 11 times that I was doing something wrong, and she was right every single time. He said, I'd forgotten what that feels like. Then he said something quieter. He said, about 40 minutes in, she said something, and I had to stop for a second. I said, what did she say? And he said, she said, okay, now you're actually singing, don't lose that. He said, and I thought, that's her. That's the actual her. He said, I've been married to the accommodating version for 7 weeks, and I met the real one on Friday afternoon because I asked her to teach me something. He said, she's been in there the whole time, Mom. He said, she's been sitting on all of that for 3 years because nobody gave her anything to be good at. I asked her about it on Saturday morning. I said, Travis says you shouted at him for 50 minutes. And Taylor Swift said, he's exaggerating. It was about 35. Then she said, he's got a very good instrument and a terrible habit, and I've been watching him do the habit since 2023, and I have never once been in a position to say anything about it. I said, why not? And she said, because you don't correct somebody's voice unless they've asked you to. She said, and he'd never asked. Then she said, Donna, do you know how long I've been sitting on notes for that man? And I said, how long? And Taylor said, since the first time I heard him sing through a wall in 2024. She said, 2 years. I've had about 6 specific things I wanted to say for 2 years, and I have said none of them, because he never asked, and it would have been rude. She said, and he called me at 1 in the morning and said, teach me, and I got to say all 6 of them in an hour. She said, it was the most fun I have had in about 4 months. Part 16. What she said. I called her on Friday afternoon. I did not tell her I had called Kylie. I did not tell her about the 11 o'clock phone call. I have since told her both of those things. On Saturday, which is today, about 2 hours before I recorded this. But on Friday, I said nothing. I said, I hear you're teaching my son to sing. And Taylor Swift said, oh, he told you. And I said, he called me at 7 in the morning. And she said, he called me at 1. I said, how did it feel? And she said, Donna, I'm going to say something, and it's going to sound ungrateful, and I need you to hear all of it. And I said, go on. She said, I have spent 3 years in this family, being loved extremely well and never once being needed. She said, everybody is wonderful to me. Everybody. Your husband is one of my favorite people alive. Kylie drove 6.5 hours to Cleveland last week without asking why. Jason calls me. You call me. She said. And in 3 years, not one single person in this family has ever asked me for anything. She said, not one thing. Not a favor, not a ride, not a recommendation, not an opinion, nothing. I said, we didn't want to be those people. And she said, I know. She said, I know exactly why. It's the same reason I don't ask you for things. Then she said, but do you know what it does? She said, it means I am the only person at that table who cannot be useful. She said, everybody else has a job. Kylie is the one who tells the truth. Jason is the one who makes noise. Ed is the one who says one sentence at the right moment. You are the one who notices everything. She said, and I am the one nobody needs anything from. She said, which is a very nice place to sit, and it is not a member of a family. It is a guest with very good access. Part 17. What I said to her. I did not say anything for a moment. And then I said, I'm sorry. And she said, Don't. Please don't. This is not a complaint. And I said, Taylor, I've been doing this for 11 years, and I did it to Kylie first. I told her about 2013, about the year I spent being careful with Kelce, holding her at arm's length, waiting to see if it would last. About Kylie telling me on the phone in 2024 that it had been a long year and that she had noticed. I told her that I have a pattern, and that I ran it on her too, and that I thought I had stopped running it when I gave her a pin in July, and that apparently I had only stopped half of it. I said, I stopped being careful about whether you belonged. I said, I never started letting you be useful. And she said, What's the difference? And I said, The difference is that one of them is about whether I trust you, and the other one is about whether I need you. And I said, I trust you completely. I have not needed you once, and that is entirely my doing. There was a pause. And then Taylor Swift said, Can I ask you for something? And I said, Yes. Part 18. What she asked me for. She said, It's small. I said, Good. And she said, There's a thing on the wedding I can't sort out, and I've been going round in circles on it for 6 weeks, and I need somebody to just tell me what to do. I said, What is it? And she said, Thank you notes. I laughed out loud. I could not help it. And she said, Don't laugh, it's genuinely a nightmare. And I said, How many? And she said, About 400. And I said, Have you started? And she said, I've done 60, and I've been stuck for 5 weeks. And every time I sit down to do more, I don't know what to say to the next one, and I put it away. I said, Why are you stuck? And she said, Because they're all different people, and some of them I know well, and some of them I've met twice, and I can't work out the right register, and if I get it wrong for somebody, it'll be a thing. She said, And I can't ask my team, because it's not their job, and it's my wedding. She said, And I've been sitting on it for 5 weeks feeling like an idiot. I said, Taylor. And she said, What? And I said, Do you know how many thank you notes I have written in 50 years? And she said, No. And I said, Neither do I. Thousands. Church, school, 2 boys, 2 weddings, 40 years of a small town. I said, I could do 400 thank you notes in my sleep. I could tell you the register for every single category of person on that list, inside 20 minutes. And she said, Really? And I said, Taylor, this is the single easiest thing anybody has asked me to do this year. And she said, Oh. And then she said very quietly, I didn't know that. I said, How could you? You've never asked. Part 19. What we did. She came to Cleveland yesterday. Friday. She flew in for the afternoon on her way somewhere else, which she does now. And she sat at my kitchen table with 340 blank cards and a list, and I sat across from her, and we did thank you notes for 5 hours. I want to tell you what that afternoon was like, because it was one of the best afternoons I have had in about 10 years. It was extremely boring. That is the point. It was completely, gloriously, magnificently boring. 2 women at a table with a stack of cards and a list, going, This one's a colleague, keep it warm and short. This one you've known 20 years, be funny. This one is somebody's mother, mention the mother. I did about 40 of them in my own handwriting because she asked me to, and because her hand was cramping. I want to give you some of that afternoon, because it was 5 hours, and I have described it as boring, and I want to prove it. The list was in categories. She had made the categories herself, and they were, I have to say, extremely good categories, because she is a person who organizes things for a living. There was a column for how she knew them. There was a column for whether they had given anything, which was almost nobody, because they had told everybody not to. And there was a column at the end that just said notes, which was where she had put things like, sat with me in 2019, and mother was ill, and do not mention the film. We started with the easy ones: colleagues, acquaintances, people met twice. I gave her the formula. There is a formula. Anybody who has written 400 thank you notes knows it, and nobody has ever written it down. I said, 3 sentences, one about them being there, one specific thing you remember about them being there, one about the future. She said, that's it? I said, that's it, 400 times. She got about 80 of them done in the first hour once she had the shape. And then we hit the hard ones. The hard ones were the people she has known a long time. She said, these are the ones I've been stuck on for 5 weeks. I said, why? And she said, because 3 sentences isn't enough, and I don't know where the ceiling is. She said, if I write 4 paragraphs to somebody, does that mean the person who got 3 sentences got less? I said, yes. And she said, right, so. And I said, and that's fine. She stopped writing. I said, Taylor, they got less because they are less. That is not an insult. You have known some of these people for 20 years, and some of them for 20 minutes. I said, the woman who has worked for you since 2008 should get 4 paragraphs. The man you met at a dinner in March should get 3 sentences and be delighted. I said, the mistake is trying to make it fair. It is not supposed to be fair. It is supposed to be true. She sat there for a second. And she said, nobody has ever told me that. And I said, about thank you notes? And Taylor Swift said, about anything. She did the hard ones in about 90 minutes after that. I did 40 in my own handwriting, at her request, for a category she called Your People. Ohio, Cleveland, football. The ones who came for Travis rather than for her. The ones she had met once at a wedding and would probably never see again. She said, you'll get the register right and I won't. Which was true. At one point, somewhere around 3 o'clock, she said, can I ask you something else? And I said, yes. And she said, is it always this specific? I said, is what? And she said, this. The knowing exactly what to say to exactly which person. Is that a thing people just have? I said, no. It's a thing people have after 50 years of a small town. I said, I have written thank you notes to every category of human being that exists. Church, school, 2 funerals, a hospital ward, people who brought food when my mother died in 1998. I said, it is the single most useless skill I have, and it is the only one nobody else in this family has got. And she said, it's not useless. And I said, Taylor, I have never once in my life been asked to use it by anybody who wasn't me. And she said, you have now. At about 4 in the afternoon, she stopped writing and said, Donna. And I said, what? And she said, I've been dreading this for 6 weeks. And I said, I know. And she said, it took 5 hours. And then she said, is this what it's like? I said, is what's like? And she said, asking somebody for something. I said, yes. And she said, it's incredibly boring. And I said, yes. And Taylor Swift said, nobody tells you that. Part 20. What Kylie said on Saturday. I called Kylie this morning. I told her the whole thing, the 1 in the morning phone call, the singing lesson, the thank you notes, 5 hours at my table. And she said, good. And I said, Kylie, I need to say something to you. And she said, oh no. I said, you were right on Thursday night and I was wrong, and I have been wrong for 3 years, and I did the same thing to you in 2013, and you told me about it in 2024, and I still did not fully learn it. And there was a pause, and Kelce said, Donna, I'm going to say something, and I want you to actually take it. And I said, all right. She said, You did not do anything to me in 2013, or to Taylor in 2023. She said, this family does this. All of you. It is not a Donna thing. It is a Kelce thing, and it goes back further than you. She said, your husband learned it from his father. Your sons learned it from him. And it is a good thing that has one flaw in it, and the flaw is that nobody in it knows how to need anybody. Then she said, and you know what the actual fix is? I said, what? And Kylie said, somebody has to go first. She said, somebody has to be the first person in a Kelce family to ask for something, out loud, badly, on the telephone at 1 in the morning. She said, and it was Travis, of all people, that enormous idiot. She said, he went first. Part 20 and a half, the other two. I told Jason on Saturday morning. Not all of it. I told him that his wife had made a phone call on Thursday night and that it had changed something. And Jason said, what phone call? And I said, she didn't tell you? And Jason Kelce said, she does not tell me anything, Mom. She has never told me anything. I find out about my own life from you. Which is not true, and which is also completely true. I told him the 6 words. We're the problem. And he went quiet. And then he said, oh, she's right. I said, you got there fast. And he said, Mom, I've known that for about 2 years. I just didn't have it in 6 words. He said, you know what I did in June? And I said, what? And he said, Taylor called me and asked if I wanted anything for the new job, the broadcasting thing. She said, do you want me to introduce you to anybody? Do you need anything? He said, and I said no. He said, I said no immediately, inside about half a second, before I'd even thought about it. He said, and she said, okay, and we talked about something else. He said, and I hung up and thought, that was nice of her. He said, and it was about 11 weeks later, this morning, when my mother told me 6 words my wife said on a telephone, that I understood what I'd actually done. He said, I told the most connected woman in America that I didn't need anything from her. He said, for the second biggest career move of my life. He said, and she has never offered again. I said, are you going to say something to her? And Jason said, I'm going to call her right now and ask her for something. And I said, for what? And he said, I have no idea. I'll think of something in the car. He called me back 2 hours later. He said, I asked her about Paris. I said, Paris? And he said, I'm calling a game in Paris in October. I've never done a game outside America. I have no idea what I'm doing. He said, and she's been to Paris about 40 times, and she knows every part of doing a job in a country where you don't live. He said, so I asked her. I said, what did she say? And Jason Kelce said, Mom, she talked for 50 minutes. He said, about hotels, and about jet lag, and about how to handle a crew you've never met, and about a specific thing to do with your voice when you're tired in a different time zone. He said, 50 minutes. I could not get her off the phone. He said, I have never heard that woman talk for 50 minutes about anything. And then I told Ed on Saturday afternoon. I told him the whole thing, in the garage, because he is always in the garage. And when I got to the 6 words, he put down what he was holding, and he said, yep. I said, yep. And Ed said, that's the family. He said, my father was the same. His father was probably the same. It goes back further than anybody can remember. He said, nobody in my family ever asked anybody for a single thing, and we all thought it was a virtue. Then he said, it's not a virtue, it's a way of never being in anybody's debt. He said, and if you're never in anybody's debt, you're never in anything with anybody. I stood in that garage and looked at my husband of 46 years. I said, Ed, how long have you known that? And Ed Kelce said, About 1994. And I said, "And you never said anything?" And he said, "Who would I have said it to?" Part 21. What I want to say. I am going to say something to the people listening now, and it is the entire reason I made this. There is somebody you love who you have never asked for anything. You have been very good to them. You have probably been extraordinarily good to them. You have done things for them without being asked, and you have absorbed things quietly, and you have never once made yourself their problem. And you think that is love. It is. It is genuinely love. I am not going to stand in a kitchen in Ohio and tell a room full of women my age that 50 years of quiet giving was wrong. But it is half of it. Here is the half nobody tells you. When you never ask somebody for anything, you are telling them something. You are telling them, "I do not need you," and you do not mean that. You mean the opposite. You mean, "I do not want to be a burden," which is the most loving thought a person can have. But that is not what arrives on the other end. What arrives is, "She has never needed me for one thing in 30 years. My son said it out loud at 11 o'clock at night on August 20th, in a voice I did not recognize, and it took my daughter-in-law from Delaware 6 words to tell him it was our fault. We're the problem. She was right. So here is what I want you to do this week, and it will take 4 minutes, and it will feel completely ridiculous. Ask somebody you love for something small, something real, something they can actually do. Something you have been quietly doing yourself for years because you did not want to bother anybody. Do not explain it. Do not make it a moment. Do not say, "I've been thinking about our relationship." Just say, "Can you help me with this?" And then let them. I have been married to Ed Kelce since 1980, and on Thursday night, after I got off the phone with Kylie, I went upstairs and woke him up and asked him to do something I have been doing myself for 11 years. I am not going to tell you what it was. It is extremely small and slightly embarrassing. He said, "Is that it?" And I said, "That's it." And he said, "Donna, I've been offering to do that since about 2015. I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. 2 days ago, my son called me furious at his wife, and he was right, and I could not help him. And a woman from Delaware who married into this family 11 years ago picked up the phone at 11:40 at night and said 6 words that reorganized 3 years. We're the problem. She has been right about this family since 2013, and it has taken us 13 years to catch up. Thank you for sitting with me today.